In today's lesson, we're going to make another bridge app, but this time we're going to integrate with our smart home. I'm using something called Home Assistant, and if you've never used Home Assistant before, it's an open source software that aims to bring all sorts of smart devices together into a single interface. And I have one smart light that we're going to work with today. I have my phone mirrored over here on the right, and you can see I can control the light with this switch right here. Turn it on, and I can turn it off. Home Assistant also has a WebSocket API where this can be controlled remotely. We're going to build a bridge app that makes use of this, and we're going to use this code right in here. This might seem a little daunting, but I'm going to walk you through every step of the way. We're going to start with the same bridge app boilerplate code that we started with in the previous lesson. I'm just going to extract this zip file, and we're going to customize it for our needs. First thing I want to do is ProtoPie Connect, and I'm going to call this Home Assistant Bridge app. And let's open it in our text editor. And we have the usual suspects, same code that we have in here. Let's customize it. So instead of boilerplate, this is going to be ProtoPie Connect, Home Assistant Bridge app. And we'll save that. And let's change our app name here. Exactly as we did before. You will recall that we need to install any dependencies that we're going to use. So let's first open this in our terminal and browse to our folder. And we're going to install the dependencies with npm install. We can see here now our dependencies have been installed, and that has installed the socket.io client, and this should work as is if we run it. And if we bring up Connect, and there we go, we do see Bridge App Ready Home Assistant Bridge. Okay, so that's working. Let's stop this. Now we do have to install additional dependencies. We need to install the WebSocket API, and that's this code here. So we're going to run npm install, and let's make this a little bigger. home-assistant.js-websocket. And --save because we want to make sure that it gets saved. And we need to install one more dependency to make the Home Assistant API work with Node. npm install ws. This stands for WebSocket --save. Our code in here, we can see we've got more things that are in here. There's ws, we've got the Home Assistant JS WebSocket, and our package.json should now include both of those things we just added. Okay, let's use this in our code. First thing we need to do is we need to include our libraries. So I'm going to create one, const, and we'll call this one HA for Home Assistant equals require Home Assistant JS WebSocket. And we need to include the WS library as well. Const WS equals require WS. In order to make our connection, we need a couple of things. We need the Home Assistant URL, and we need some way to authenticate. You recall when we made the Weather API, we hard-coded those things in our code. But I want to make this a more flexible app. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to start within our apps here. And this app, by the way, this is what we're going to be using to control the light. If we look at this in Connect, let's open both of these in Connect here. And I'm going to make a group, and let's drag both of these in here. And if we start this multi-view group, we're going to see we get both of these side by side. You'll recognize this from one of the first lessons where we made pies talk to each other. And you can see as we move our living room slider left and right, it controls this orange square over here, indicating the light level. We're also going to have our light over here respond to this as well. In this pie, we're going to add some configuration. So let's add a start trigger here. Start. And I'm going to do 2 sends here. To ProtoPie Studio, and I'm going to say HA URL and send the value. This will be the same for most people. Quote, HTTP home assistant dot local colon 8123. And I'm going to send one more. Send to ProtoPie Studio. We're going to call this HA auth. And this is something that's going to identify you, so that way just not anybody can control your smart home here. Now, there are a number of different ways that we can do it, but we're going to use a simple way. Because we're just creating a prototype, a proof of concept, we're going to do things in a bit more of a hacky way. Production code wouldn't look like this, but we're just trying to get things to work. So we can do things this way. We can get away with this. In Home Assistant, click on your name in the bottom left corner and scroll all the way down to the bottom. You're going to see this item, Long-Lived Access Tokens. Click on Create Token. Give it a name. I'm going to call this ProtoPie Connect Token. And when you click OK, this will be the only time you see this token. So it's important that you copy this now. If you close it before you copy it, you're going to need to destroy the token and create a new one. So I'm going to close that, and let's go over here, and I'm going to add the token into our authorization here. Okay, and now if we take a look at Connect, we should see, here, let's clear this, and we'll go over to our multi-view here, and let's refresh this. We should see messages coming in. There we go. We've got our Home Assistant URL and our Home Assistant authorization token. Let's go over to our code here. And let's create variables for both of those. Let HA URL, let HA auth. And in our messages coming in, we're going to look for these right here. So we're going to remove these comments here like we did before. And we have HA URL. And I don't want to log this out. I want to add this to our HA variable. So HA URL equals message.value. And I want to do the same thing for the auth one. And in both of these, let's write out the result to the console. Console.log URL and console.log HA auth. Save that. And we should now be able to start our code, npm start. We are running, and let's refresh this. There we go. We have our Home Assistant URL, and we have our authorization key here. Okay, I don't want to make my connection to Home Assistant until I have both of these. So we're just going to put in a little bit of code here. So instead of this console.log, I don't really need this anymore. And if HA auth does not equal null, then I'm going to do something. And we'll do HA make connection. This doesn't exist yet, but we're going to make this. And similarly, I'll copy this over here, but instead, when I get the HA auth, I'm going to check to see if I already have the URL. So essentially, I'm only going to make the connection if both of these have been filled in. So in this case, HA URL gets filled in. I'm checking to see if the authorization key has come through yet. If so, I'm going to tell it to make the connection. And then over here, same thing. I'm filling in the authorization key, and I'm checking to see if the URL has been filled in. If so, I'm going to make my connection. So it won't make the connection until both the URL and the authorization key have been received. Now let's go over and let's actually write our code. Let's make a section over here. Let's copy this. And we'll call this Home Assistant stuff. We're going to need to keep track of a couple of things. So we already have our HA object here. This is the actual link to the library itself. We need to make a variable for the connection. I'm going to call this HA socket. And this is going to be something called an asynchronous function. And this is because we're going to make the request to connect to Home Assistant, and then we're going to wait. We're going to wait for the response. So we need to use the keyword async. This is a function. And we're going to use the HA make connection that we created above. And let's open this up. And let's make some log output here. Console.log. Connecting to, and then we're going to put in our HA URL here. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to create our authorization. So I'm going to create a constant. We're going to call this HA auth, and it's ha.create long live token auth. And I got all this, by the way, from the WebSocket API. You'll find code examples here for everything we're doing today. And this takes in two parameters. So our HA URL and our HA authorization token. Now we're going to make our connection. And our connection is going to come back and it's going to be attached to the HA socket variable we made. So we're going to say HA socket equals. And this is where we're going to make our connection asynchronously. We're going to use the keyword await. What this will do is this will instruct our code to try and make the connection and wait for it to come back with a response. So it won't execute any other code underneath until it's come back. And we're going to say ha.create connection. It's this one right down here. And we need to pass in the authorization object. So auth, HA auth. And I'm just going to put in some error handling code here. So if we get an error here, then I'm going to say console.log Home Assistant connection failed. And let's also include the error that has come with it. And we'll call our, way down the bottom here, we have this exit. We'll call exit. So if the authentication fails, the app is just going to exit completely. Okay, now let's see if this works. I'm going to stop my app here and we'll restart it in npm start. Okay, not doing anything because we now need to refresh our code here because it needs to send in both the URL and the authorization. So let's refresh this. Okay. Connection failed. Reference error WebSocket is not defined. Okay, so this is something specific to Node. If you're using another language, you're not going to run into this, but with Node in particular, a WebSocket client is not installed. And the API here is expecting a variable called WebSocket. And that's why we included this up here. So what we're going to do is we're going to add this WebSocket variable to the global namespace. So global.WebSocket equals, and then we have our variable here, WS, we're going to use that, WS. Let's save that. We'll start our code again, npm start. And let's refresh this. Okay, it says connecting, but we don't have any feedback to say that it is connected. But everything worked, our app didn't crash, but let's give ourselves some actual feedback here. So we've created our connection here. Now the await will cause the code to stall and stop execution until the connection has been made or an error comes back. And we saw that error come back when our app crashed last time. But if we do something here, console.log Home Assistant connected to, and then we'll use the HA URL. We should see this now output in our code after the connection has been made. So stop our app, restart, refresh here, and there we go. We have right here connecting to Home Assistant local and connected. That's it. We've created our connection now. We need to make a little bit of code to respond to the brightness message. Recall that the way that this works is we're sending two messages coming in, and you can see them coming through over here. We have the message room and we have the message brightness. We want to respond only when the room is living room, first of all, because we're working with this living room light. And we're going to use the brightness. Now, the interesting thing about the way the brightness works, in our code, brightness can be a value between 0 and 100. 0 for the light being completely off, 100 for it being full brightness, and anywhere in between is a level of dimming. In Home Assistant, it expects a number between 0 and 254. So let's go back into our code here. And the message coming in. Now, we want to make sure that we're only reacting when the room equals living room. So we need to react to that message first. So case room. And we need to assign this value somewhere. So let's make a let room. And we're going to say room equals message.value. In case brightness, and we're going to do something here. I'm just going to leave this empty for now. Let's log this out. Console.log room. So we should see this now. Let's stop and start our code. We'll go here. Refresh this. And let's now make a change to our brightness. Okay, and we can see room is living room. And if I adjust one of the other sliders, room now equals dining room. We only want to react when room equals living room. So let's go back to our code and let's write that in here. If room equals living room, we're only going to react to the brightness message if room equals living room. And let's just say, we'll just call this set brightness. And we'll create a function down here for it. And we'll pass in message.value. So down here, function set brightness. And we'll just call this variable b. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to convert b into a number. So b equals number b, because it's actually coming in as text from ProtoPie Connect. And then we need to convert it into a number between 0 and 254. So it's coming in as a number between 100, and this makes it easy. So we're going to divide by 100 and multiply by 254. And then I want to do one of two things. If the value of brightness is 0, or we're going to use near 0 just to account for small decimals. So if it's less than 1, for example, we're just going to turn the light off altogether. If it's greater than 1, we're going to turn the light on and set the brightness level at the same time. And we're going to use a function called call service built into the Home Assistant API. So that looks like this. If, and we're going to say if brightness is less than 1, then here we're going to turn light off, else turn light on to specified brightness. Okay, and here's what that looks like. ha.call service. We need to use our connection, which is HA socket. We need to call something called a domain, and the domain is the type of device it is. In this case, it's a light. And the service name we're going to use, which is turn off. And the last parameter is an object, and we need to pass in something called an entity ID. Entity ID. And this is the specific device that we're going to work with. Now, if we go back to Home Assistant and we take a look, we have this one called Living Room Light. Now, that's the friendly name. But if you click on the gear icon here, you're getting its entity IDs, light.living_room. That's the value we need here. Now, again, we could hard code this in here, but I don't want to hard code this. I would actually like to make this also configurable. So much the same way that we had the Home Assistant URL and the Home Assistant auth object, I would like to use HA entity. And let's include that in our Pi over here. So we're going to send to ProtoPie Studio, HA entity, and the value I'm going to do is light.living_room. Okay. Now in our code, let's receive that message. Let's just put it up here. HA entity. And we're going to say HA entity equals message dot value. Now we've got these checks, and this was easy when we only had 2 things to check for, but now we have 3 things to check for, and we're duplicating our code. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change this, and I'm going to call make connection every single time, and we're going to handle checking for these 3 values in the make connection function itself. So let's go into make connection over here. Where are you? Here we go. And we're going to add a little bit of code up in here. If ha.url equals null, or ha auth equals null, or ha entity equals null. Then I'm just going to say return. And this will break out of our function before we do anything below here. So you're going to see, we won't see Home Assistant connecting to HA URL until we provided all 3 of these. I'm going to save this. Let's stop and start our code. Let's go back to our multi-view here and let's refresh. Okay. Oh, right. I made a mistake here. So let's take a look at our code in here. Brightness, it's not, we called it B. Actually, we'll call this brightness. And the same thing. Okay. Start our code again. Refresh. Okay, so we received the message HA URL, HA auth, HA entity, and you're going to see we don't connect until we've received all 3 of those. Now we can add in our entity ID. And now we're going to do something similar for when we have brightness greater than 1. So let's pop this in here. This time the service will be turn on. And we're going to add in one more item into the data here. So brightness equals, oh, we need to fix this. Let's change this to brightness as well. We'll just overwrite the brightness variable here. Brightness equals brightness. We should be able to control our light now. Let's see if this works. Oh, right. So it should not be an equal sign, so we're going to use a colon here instead. Okay. Now let's see what happens when we refresh. All right. Well, we have an error here. Cannot read properties of undefined reading send message promise. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, we've called call service. And you're going to see room and brightness is coming in. When we start, we're getting messages from all of our items in here. And we have connecting to Home Assistant local. And then we're trying to send this call service. We haven't connected yet to Home Assistant. We need to make sure that we don't call service until we have an active connection. So in here, same thing. In our brightness function in here, I'm going to add in a check. If HA socket equals null, same thing, return. So I can only call set brightness when I have an active connection. Let's try this again. and refresh this. Okay, our app didn't crash. Let's see what happens. Let's bring this over here. Make it so we can see the whole thing. Let's adjust our light here. And look at that. We are controlling our smart home from ProtoPie. And that wasn't that hard to do, was it? Now we're going to do a couple more things here. We're going to take this a little bit further. You do recognize that this is the same Pi we used in a previous lesson where we had our date and time in the bottom corner over here. And what we can do is we can actually have multiple bridge apps running at the same time. So I'm going to make a new tab here. This works in Mac OS with Command T, and I'm going to assume that you can do something similar in Windows. I think you make a new command window. And let's get our code from the previous lesson. CD npm start. We have our bridge app running, and if we refresh this, there we go. Look at that. We've got our date, we've got our time, we've got all of our weather information, and we can control our light. Okay. The last thing I'm going to show you is a convenient way to turn this into something that's a little bit more portable. Right now we've got this code in here, and we need to go through, browse to, in the terminal, type in some stuff in here, and that's not exactly friendly for the average designer. I'd like to turn this into a plugin. Now if we go into Connect, we have a bunch of built-in plugins already. Right? We have the IF plugin, we got the G29, Arduino, and block dots. And what we can do is we can turn our code into a plugin. So let's stop our app here. I'm going to use something called package for this. And this is something you can install with Node. So npm install. This is just like installing a dependency for your app, but we're going to use -G. And this now installs it as a global app, which means I can run this from anywhere. It's not a dependency for my project. It's just something that's installed like a normal app on my PC. And it's called PKG. Okay, got an error. So when you're installing on Mac, you have to give it elevated permissions. So we're going to use sudo npm install pkg-g. And there we go. And you'll know you'll have it installed if you do pkg-h. You should get some help information on how to use it. We can use this. This is now going to compile our code into an executable. And pay attention to right in here, targets. You need to specify what architecture you want to target here, because a Mac executable won't run on Windows. And in fact, there's multiple flavors of Mac. So you've got Mac with Apple Silicon and Mac with Intel chips. You need to make two separate versions of the plugin for those particular ones. I'm going to make ones for Windows, Mac Intel, and Mac Apple Silicon. So here's how this works. PKG-T, that's the targets, and all of the targets are made up of three pieces. The node version you want, I'm going to use node 16, dash the operating system, so this will be Mac OS, and then the architecture. So Apple Silicon is ARM64, comma, no space here by the way, or else you'll get an error. Node 16, I'm going to do another one here for Mac OS, and this will be X64, this means Intel, comma, node 16 dash Windows or Win dash X64. This will make three versions of my plugin. Oh, right, and you have to specify a file here. So let's do this again, and I want to compile index.js. Okay, now you're going to see if we take a look in our file system here, we have three extra files here. Index-win-x64, this is our Windows executable, and you can see it has the familiar .exe extension. Then we have two for Mac OS. X64, this is for Intel Mac, and ARM64, this is for Apple Silicon Mac. We need to turn both of these into executable files, and you only have to do this for the Mac ones, by the way, and that is a rather cryptic command, chmod, which stands for change mode. I want to make it executable, so +X. I'm adding the executable flag to it. And index-Mac, and I want to do this for both of them, so I'm just going to use The star here, this is a wildcard. So any file name with the start index-mac, which as you can see is both of these, will be set here. There we go. And then I need to make a file here. We're going to call this, I'm going to make a new file, and it's going to look like this. Name, and you need to give it a name. Home Assistant Bridge plugin. Let's save this, and you want to save it in the directory here. We're going to call it metadata.json. Oh, and it doesn't like it because I didn't put this in quotes. Remember that JSON, both the keys and the values need to be in double quotes for it to be valid JSON. So we'll save that. Okay. And then all we're going to do is we're going to zip these up. Now, the plugins need to be called plugin.exe for Windows or just plugin. So we're going to do the Windows one first. We'll call this plugin. And let's take that one and metadata.json, compress these into a zip file. And I'm going to call this Home Assistant plugin, and we'll go Windows. I can't spell. Home Assistant plugin, Windows. And now let's do our Intel Mac version. So we're going to rename this plugin. Right click, compress these. And I'm just going to copy this. Mac Intel. And this one also needs to be called plugin, so I just need to rename this. We'll just call this .Mac Intel. And we'll rename this one plugin. Compress these two. Mac, Apple, Silicon. All right, these are my plugin files, and I would use the one appropriate for my operating system. And once again, I cannot spell, so let's fix these. Shouldn't be Homa, should be Home. Doesn't really matter, it'll still work, but I would like to have this spelled correctly. Okay, our code is not running, so if we go over here, this should be ineffectual. So if I start this, I am getting date and time because my date and time app is still running. But if I change the brightness of the slider here, you're going to see it's not affecting my light at all. And that's what we expect because the code is not running. Let's now use the plugin instead. Let's go over to Connect. And from the top right, choose plugin and hit this plus. You'll only see this plus, by the way, if you are on an enterprise subscription. This won't work if you just have a ProtoPie Pro subscription. You have to have an enterprise one. Click on plus, and we're just going to use the appropriate plugin. In my case, I have an M1 Mac here, so I'm going to use the Apple Silicon one. And we should see this run now. If I click on run, good, it is running, and we see Bridge App Ready. And if you want to see the output, you can do that. Click on Open in Terminal, and this will look similar to what we had before. So now if I go to my app here, I need to refresh. And there we go. Now let's take a look at our output. Home Assistant connecting to right there. And we should see the connection somewhere. Here we go, Home Assistant connected to. So it's a bit of a mess, it's hard to see it that's in here, but this lets us know that we are connected, and we should now be able to control our light. And there we go, that's working. If I go all the way to 0, light goes off. And if I go all the way up, light goes on. So there you go. Really quick example of how you can connect to your smart home and control actual physical devices, in this case, a smart light. We've made our app configurable, so that way we can use a different URL. So let's say you've got your Home Assistant installed somewhere that's not standard. We specified our authorization, and this will be unique to you. And we specified what particular light that we are going to work with. We've shown you that it's possible to run multiple bridge apps simultaneously to put together a holistic experience. So I've got one app that is connecting over here to control my smart light. I've got a second app over here that's providing me date and time and weather. And I've showed you how to turn this into something that's portable. So you can share this plugin around with somebody. So instead of giving somebody instructions, download the code, install dependencies, yada, 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 you can just give them this nice little zip file with a couple of instructions to get this running in ProtoPie Connect. And if I stop this, by the way, this stays in my list. And I'm going to close ProtoPie Connect and I'm going to open it again. You're going to see my plugin persists. It's still there. So all I need to do is run it. And there you go. Easy as pie.